vehicle. I love it, except
Hi, Mary.
for a long trip. I mean, if we're really,
Carolyn.
you guys, you know, to fill up the car, it's 10 minutes.
I got worried about whether David could get in because he didn't even, well, because we pre-registered, he didn't know he was supposed to do that to get in. It's like, oh my goodness, he's the presenter.
Did he pre-register?
Yeah, he did, but
Okay.
like an hour ago.
Okay. He'll have to make sure to sign on early.
Yeah, I told him to sign on 10 minutes early maybe. But
Okay.
so I've gotten a couple questions coming into the law butterfly email.
Mm-hmm.
I should forward them to David or how to handle that. One of them in Santa Cruz that she wants, I mean, she notices the monarchs in Santa Cruz, but she was like, well, they're not really overwintering because they just stay there kind of.
How about do you want to read them off to David James at the end of the meeting?
Okay, that sounds good.
Because I'm going to ask everybody to hold their questions till the end of the meeting.
That sounds
good.
And
then that should give you an opportunity to just go through them, and then he'll see them at least.
Okay, sounds good. There it is. Okay. I saw a cat's tail.
Yes, she likes to be part. Paper, go. Go, 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 go.
Testing 1, 2, 3.
Vacancy, yes. Has anybody seen any good butterflies lately? Boring butterflies?
There's always the cabbage white.
Of course.
It's snowing here in Missoula, Montana, so I don't think we're going to see anything.
Oh, who said morning cloaks? I just saw that for an instant.
It was Amy.
Amy. Oh,
Hi,
oh
David.
David James. Yay.
Yay.
You're muted, David.
Hello, good evening.
Hi, David.
Hello, everybody.
Hi
Good
there.
to see.
Hi, Dave. This is Joe.
Hi, Joe.
And Dave's there.
Yeah, I can see Dave too.
I've got my binoculars.
So Dave, will any of your gorgeous little girls be making an appearance tonight?
I think they might be, yeah. Yeah,
All right. I guess they're not all quite as little as they once were.
that's true. That's very true. I'm going to have to minimize something and get my PowerPoint ready. I'd forgotten to do that. So here we go.
Hi, you people. How are you?
Hello.
There's Carol and there's Mary and Carl. How come you can't see me?
Is your video on? There.
There it is. Now we can see me.
Did anybody see the story about the rose-breasted grosbeak, red-breasted grosbeak that was half female and half male? It was in the news today on Here and Now.
No, I didn't see it.
It was half on the left side and half on the right side. One side was male, one side was female, and they said it might still be able to reproduce. It's a really good story. It's on Here and Now on the website. Yeah.
On the WABA website?
No, it's one of the NPR shows. It's called Here and Now.
Here and Now.
Yeah.
Tanya?
Hi.
She can't see. I'm way back there.
She's connected.
Hey, Tanya.
Hello, how are you guys doing?
Good.
Good.
Well,
Who is that? Who's?
I've got Bella.
Oh, hi, Bella.
Hi.
oh my gosh.
Oh, you can say hi.
Oh my gosh.
Boy, David, you look like you got younger with that beard and the long hair.
Well, thank you very much. It makes me look older, actually, but okay.
No, it makes you look like you're back in the 60s.
That's good.
Boy, a lot of people here. Wow.
It's marvelous.
Yeah.
So we're gonna wait a few more
Oh,
minutes.
there's
and we're gonna give
John.
people a little bit more time to sign in. And
There's
then
Melanie.
I will start my announcements.
Hi, John.
Hi, Sue.
Tanya, can you see my shawl? No, you can't. Okay.
Wait, what were you asking?
This is your shawl, honey. Can't you see that? Dave, hold it.
Where are you? Oh, I love your shawl. Oh, that's gorgeous.
Thank you.
You're so welcome. You've been enjoying it. I'm glad.
It's always
Yay. Nice to see you, lovely people.
yeah, it's good to see you guys. It's like kind of therapy for us.
Definitely. Definitely. Dave, you look fantastic. You guys, you and Joe are feeling
Dave,
good.
it's good to see you. Yes.
Oh, I'm feeling wonderful.
Awesome.
That is so cool.
All the way up.
Okay, I think we're gonna get started. We have a few people still possibly gonna show up, but looks like the majority is here. My name is Mary Hsu. I'm the Washington Butterfly Association president. We are an organization that does meetings like this in Seattle and Spokane, September through May. In the springtime and fall, summertime, we go on field trips. And then once a year, we have a butterfly study weekend at somewhere in the state where we all can get together, do a keynote speak, and go on field trips. Of course, with COVID, that is tentative, but this year, hopefully it'll take place in the Blue Mountains in July, but that's very tentative. So tonight we have a presentation by Dr. David James on monarchs, which everybody I'm sure is excited to hear. But before we do that, I just wanted to let you know that we are a membership. So if you're interested in doing a membership or a donation, I was going to share my screen for about 30 seconds and show you how to log on if you're interested. Okay, so if you're interested in becoming a member of the Washington Butterfly Association, you just type in the washingtonbutterflyassoc.org. You go to the website, you go to membership and donations. And here you can either pay on the computer or pay by mail, or if you need to renew your membership, this is a great way to do it if you don't want to do a check, or you can pay by mail, or you can make a donation. But if you're interested in joining our organization, which is a very awesome, fun organization, I suggest you do that. So I think that was all my announcements. In November, we have the Mothman giving a presentation, which is Carl.
Hey, Carl.
And then in January, Spokane. Now this is Spokane meetings. We also have Seattle meetings on the first week of the month as well, September through May. And the one Spokane's giving in January possibly will be with David Droppers. And then we also have one scheduled. We don't know what February, March, or April will be, but in May we have Glenn from the Insectarium in Missoula doing a presentation on bugs. So we're very excited for that. So that's upcoming stuff. I'm going to go ahead and have John Bowman announce Dr. David James and get this started. Also, please hold your questions till the very end, if you would. Thank you.
So I want to thank you all as well for being here. This is perhaps the largest Zoom crowd that I've ever been a part of. And to have this turnout for Northwest and Washington butterflies is amazing and wonderful. And it's practically enough to give me a case of stage fright. But in any case, I want to shout out a number of wonderful things that I can share with you about David James's background, going back to when I first met him on our Blue Mountains conference with the Butterfly Association in 2008, which is the first contact I ever had with anything in the Butterfly Association. He took us on a bunch of wonderful field trips way up in the hills along with David Nunnally, and that hooked me on being part of WBA and starting, in fact, the very Spokane chapter that you are now connecting with. So it's a small world, and we have much to be grateful for with regards to David and his co-author, David. David James has numerous publications in various scientific journals, including that for the Lepidoptera Society. But the one that I'd like to call out tonight is one that you all really want to have. This is Life Histories of Cascadian Butterflies with lovely photographs, cover to cover, dense information on the entire life cycle of every butterfly in the Northwest, Cascadia. Although I understand from meeting David up at Slate Peak this summer that he was still on the lookout for the Melissa's Arctic. So I need to ask, by way of handing off, if he in fact has been able to raise his Melissa Arctic larvae yet. David, we're giving you a big hand and begging to hear the answer to your question. This Melissa's Arctic, did you get them?
No, afraid not.
Ah, they were there.
I know they were there, and people saw them, but we weren't one of the lucky people to see them. So didn't even see it, let alone catch a female. So no, that will have to wait for another year, unfortunately.
Always a good place to visit.
And that the reason for this conversation is that it's the only species out of the 160 or so in the Pacific Northwest that we didn't do, Dave Nunnally and I, in the book that John just showed you there. So it's elusive, but one day perhaps we'll get it. Okay, so I'm ready to go, am I?
Take it away, David.
I shall share my screen, hopefully. Okay. If I can get to the beginning. I'll have to go down here. Okay. All right, can everybody see that? Hopefully, yes. Okay, so migration biology and conservation of monarch in the Western US. That's what I'm going to be talking about. Something that's been very close to my heart for a long time, actually. I did my PhD on the monarch in Australia, because the monarch does exist in Australia too. So that was back in '84. So the monarch has been part of my life for a very long time indeed. And it's, unfortunately, we may be losing it to some extent. I mean, certainly the populations today, particularly in the Western US, are much less than they were back in the '80s, for example. And when I was working on the monarch in Sydney, Australia. It is the world's butterfly. It's not just North American. As I said, it's in Australia. I grew up in England, and I knew about the monarch then as an 8-year-old lepidopterist. I knew about the monarch because it was in my book. I never saw one. Occasionally monarchs from the Eastern US will get blown across the Atlantic into England almost every year. One or two will be found, and sometimes hundreds are found. So it's a rarity in England, and a rarity that I never got to see as an amateur lepidopterist, a child lepidopterist. But you know, if you see butterflies in children's books throughout the world, it doesn't really matter what country you're in, the example that will be given is invariably a monarch. So it is the world's butterfly, and so perhaps we have, you know, even greater responsibility for it than just thinking about North America. So why is the monarch important? Well, you know, I look at a number of people that are listening to me talking about the monarch here today on this Zoom meeting, and that's another example of the power of the monarch, as I like to call it. And this slide shows a release of monarchs that we had here in Yakima in central Washington, where I am located. We have a a breeding program with the local land conservancy, the Cowishi Canyon Conservancy, and as part of that, we have a release day when the docents that have reared monarchs get to release the monarch. And so, you know, we tell everybody that the monarchs are going to be released, and we have literally hundreds of people turn up. And we're only a small town, and we have hundreds of people like this turn up to see monarchs flying away, which is quite remarkable. That such is the appeal of the monarch to everybody, not just children, not just people like us. Inmates at prisons, which I'll talk about more later on, are enthralled by monarchs. So it really is something, this butterfly attracts a lot of people for some unknown reason. But, you know, beyond that, it has a you know, important function in ecosystems in which it exists. It's a pollinator, and there's a lot of concern and talk about pollinators these days. In the old days, we just used to think of honeybees as pollinators, and certainly they are probably the most important pollinator, but there's a lot of other insect pollinators too, including butterflies and other insects as well. So it plays a role as a pollinator, and it's the sum total of all the pollinators that give us our pollination services. We're losing, well, to some extent, honeybees are declining in some parts of the country. So, you know, the rest of the pollinators have become even more important. The monarch is a component of the food chain, of course. I mean, like every organism is, there's things that prey upon it, be it birds that have learned to overcome the chemical defenses of the monarch, or small mammals. It's part of the food chain of a number of species. But most importantly, I think the monarch, as well as butterflies generally, are important environmental indicators. They are the organisms that tend to suffer first, and the things that we see suffering first when things are going wrong with the environment. So they're sort of like the canary in the coal mine, if you like. In fact, somebody called them the canary in the cornfield. So when butterflies decline, it means there's something wrong with the environment, and therefore perhaps we should pay attention, because if they start declining, then the organisms that depend upon them may also start declining, and ultimately ourselves will suffer if the environment is being degraded or you know, becoming less habitable in some way. So they can be important environmental indicators, and the monarch is an example of that. And with its current decline, it does suggest that our environment is being degraded in some way that's causing the decline. So we should take notice of this. But, you know, it's no shame to simply love and conserve the monarch for what it is, a beautiful work of art. And I'm sort of borrowing the words of Lincoln Brower here, who was the premier monarch specialist and researcher and conservationist, who unfortunately passed away just a year ago. And he was the first to say that, you know, just as we love and appreciate art, you know, why can't we value the artistry of nature in the same way? And the monarch is a good example of that, a great example. All butterflies are, obviously, but the monarch is a good example. And we should just appreciate it for its aesthetic value as much as its role in the environment and, you know, and any other function that it might have. We can simply appreciate it, which is, I'm sure we all do. The monarch has become a flagship species in our initiative to protect and conserve pollinators. As I mentioned briefly, pollinators are in trouble, and this has been recognized by governments around the world, particularly in North America, Canada, US, and Mexico have a tri-country agreement about pollinator initiative to try and protect and conserve pollinators generally. And the monarch has become the flagship species of that movement for good reason, for all the reasons I've just talked about in its appeal. It's probably more appealing to people than a honeybee. And so it's become a flagship species. And a lot of people realize that pollinators are in trouble because of the monarch, because of the publicity that the monarch has engendered in the last couple of years. So it is an icon, and it is under threat. In August 2014, a petition for listing the monarch under the Endangered Species Act was enacted. And 6 years later, we're still waiting for the decision on that. But it should be announced in December, so just a couple of months' time. And, from once being one of the most common butterflies in the US, it's now reached the position where it could be declared a threatened or endangered species under the ESA Act. Personally, I hope that does not happen, because there'll be rules and regulations. We won't be able to touch monarchs anymore, probably. We won't be able to do a lot of things that we do now. But I applaud the fact that it was petitioned for listing, because in the time since August 14, 2014, so many more people know about the threat to the monarch and the fact that it's declining. I mean, before that date, not many people knew, except the people that were interested in the monarch. Now there's a much broader spectrum of people that realize the monarch is in trouble. And because of that, many conservation projects have been enacted throughout the US. Milkweed is being grown throughout the country to help restore milkweed populations of on which the monarch depends. And so a lot has been done just by simply listing it as potentially endangered. So the listing has done amazing things in terms of increasing the awareness of monarchs and the threat they face. So we'll find out in December if it's going to be declared a threatened species. So this slide shows Mexico from the air, the overwintering population of monarchs in Mexico back in 1997, picture taken by Lincoln Brower. When the population back in the mid-1990s throughout the US was probably at its peak in the 80s and 90s. And is estimated 1 billion butterflies in the eastern US. The eastern US populations all overwinter in Mexico. So they all fly down to Mexico for overwintering. And so you can see here from this aerial shot, just clouds of monarchs flying there, just a huge amount. But fast forward almost 20 years to 2016, and the similar area or the same area, and you can see there's a bit of orange on the trees there, but nothing like 20 years prior. And estimates suggest that there was a 95% decline during that period of time. Still 95 million sounds like a lot of butterflies, and it is, but it's not the billion that was there 20 years before. So a substantial decline during that time frame from about the mid-1990s, fast forward to 10, 20 years after that. And this is shown graphically here. And this graph shows the area occupied by the Mexican overwintering colonies from about 97 to 2020, to last year, last overwintering season. And so you can see there's been a steady decline. I mean, it's not gone down just, there's been ups and downs all the way along. And sometimes, it's looked pretty promising that the population's rebounding, but then it's gone down to, in some years like 2013, 14, I think, to half a hectare. So the population's measured in hectares that they occupy overwintering. And this is just, trees just completely full of monarchs. So many millions of monarchs in a small area. But back in 97, it was 16 hectares. And I think a hectare is about 2¼ acres. So you can imagine the acreage back in the 90s of wall-to-wall monarchs, if you like. And then, last year it was 2 point something, nearly 3 hectares. And so there's a big decline in that period of time. And that's what we're worried about. And then the question is, why did the decline occur during that time frame? And there are a number of things that happened during that time frame, but a couple of things stand out. And really, we don't know the reason why monarchs have declined. We don't know. There isn't a single reason. It's probably a multiplicity of reasons. And there's a couple of things we can point to as perhaps playing a role. And one of these is the adoption of genetically engineered crops, genetically engineered to resist or to be not vulnerable to herbicide. They are safe from herbicide. So you can you can spray these crops, soybeans, cotton, corn, that are genetically engineered to resist herbicide. You can now spray these crops from the air and not kill the crop. Prior to 97 or the mid 90s, to get weeds out of these broadacre crops, and I'm talking about the Midwest here, where it is the vast acreage of these crops exists. In the days before GMO crops, you had to, the farmer had to go around killing the weeds as best he could with sprays and tractors and such like, and it was never 100% effective. So milkweed actually thrived within crops, these crops, on a quite significant basis, and studies have been done to show that monarchs actually thrived in this situation. They actually liked laying their eggs and developing on milkweed within these crops, and maybe the protection it gave, whatever. But with the advent of these crops, and so you can see a steady adoption of the use of these genetically engineered crops during the same time frame that the monarchs have declined to about 100%. These days, all the crops are genetically engineered. So there are vast areas in the Midwest of the US that don't have milkweed within crops because of the effectiveness of spraying now. So some people have suggested that this vast acreage that's now not good monarch breeding habitat is one of the reasons for the decline. It may have played a role. Nobody can say definitively that it has, but it's a possibility. Milkweed does still occur in these areas along the roadsides and in ditches and such like. So it's not like milkweed is totally gone, but there's certainly far less than there used to be. So that's one possibility. Another possibility is the rise in the use of a group of chemicals called neonicotinoids. And this is a class of chemicals that's actually very safe to people. And that's one of the major reasons why it was so readily adopted. And you can see this graph shows its adoption from 95 to 2010. And it's now, neonicotinoids are now ubiquitous. They're the chemicals that are most often used. These are insecticides. They're most often used in agriculture and in home gardens. And although they were safe for people, replacing materials that were less safe for people prior to 95, and they are, we've discovered since that time, they do have sublethal effects on a number of organisms, including pollinators. They are suggested as being one of the causes of honeybee decline and decline of many other pollinators too. Not because they necessarily kill pollinators outright, these chemicals, but because they perhaps reduce the reproductive potential or longevity of the pollinators. They don't live as long. So over a single generation, it may not be a big deal, but over multiple generations, these sublethal effects accumulate and eventually cause decline of population. So we have widespread butterfly decline, not just monarch decline. And it's possible that neonicotinoid use has played a role in that. Again, we don't know for sure, but it's a possibility. And as I said, it's not just agriculture, but it's also home gardens too. And the amount of neonicotinoids applied, or the rates used in home gardens, is generally much greater than in agriculture. So home garden use could be a problem for pollinators as well as agriculture. And in fact, places like the Home Depot have decided to phase out the use of neonicotinoids on the plants they sell, which is good. I don't know that other big box stores have followed suit, but they need to do that probably. But you see there on the screen, there's some chemicals listed on the left-hand side. So, neonicotinoid is the class of chemicals, and you can't just pick up a insecticide in the Home Depot and look for the word neonicotinoid. You're going to have to look for the words that are on the left there, which are the names of the actual chemicals, which are neonicotinoids, but they all have different names like acetamiprid, imidacloprid, and so on there. So those are the names that you need to recognize so that you know whether you're using neonicotinoids or not. And the thing with neonicotinoids is also, not only are they're persistent, they're systemic. So they get into the plant and they're long-lived as well. And so they can be translocated within plants into the nectar of plants. And there's been studies done in recent years showing that they are in very small quantities in nectar of plants that insects like pollinators are, feeding on, using the nectar. So they can, pollinators can get a dose of sublethal dose of neonicotinoid simply just by nectaring on the plant. Interestingly, neonicotinoids are banned in Europe because of the concern over their impact on pollinators. From a couple of years ago, they're now not used in agriculture at all. And they're being reviewed in the US and Canada, but that review's been happening for some time. So I don't think anything's going to happen very soon. So neonicotinoids are a possible cause for butterfly and monarch decline. And so the quantities in plants is listed here. There's small amounts, but we're talking about parts per billion, which is a very small amount. It's a bit hard to describe, but parts per billion, in crops 50 to 100, and then going up to glasshouse crops, we're up to 21,000 parts per billion. And even that's still not lethal to many things, but obviously it's an amount that's more concerning than 50 parts per billion. And so you can see home gardens are in the middle there, and landscape trees and bushes are even higher. And so, I've been concerned about this for some time. So I did a small experiment in 2018 with monarch butterflies, just feeding them neonicotinoid laced sugar solution, just 23.5 parts per billion. So in context with that previous slide, it's a very small amount, but it's the amount I chose because it's an amount that has been recorded in the nectar of wildflowers around crops. So it's a field realistic level that pollinators would encounter. But in my experiment, of course, with the butterflies that I fed the laced sugar, they had no choice. So in the wild, of course, they would have a bit of choice. But I wanted to see if this small amount would have any impact on them. And it did. It shortened their lives, basically. There was nearly 80% mortality after 3 weeks, which, a monarch is supposed to live at least 6 weeks if it's reproductive, which these were. And of course, non-reproductive monarchs live a lot longer than that. So it was a very small experiment, and it needs to be done again. But it did suggest that low levels of neonicotinoid, one particular neonicotinoid, which is called imidacloprid, and there's a reference there. And if anyone's interested, just email me and I'll send you the original paper. But it does suggest that it is a possibility that the length of monarch life could be reduced if it fed upon too much nectar laced with neonicotinoids. And so, in the length of life a monarch has, it's a definite possibility. And another thing that we're seeing in recent times in the West, anyway, I haven't heard if it's been happening in the East, but a lot of wild eggs that people are finding appear to be sterile. They're not producing larvae. They're just dying. And prior to a couple of years ago, we weren't seeing that. And so that's a bit strange. And it makes me wonder if neonicotinoids are playing a role in that, sterilizing the eggs within a female. All these sublethal effects, hard to actually find out what they are without experimentation like this, but they could be occurring unknown and unseen. So we need to do more research to actually determine what neonicotinoids are actually doing to butterflies and pollinators generally. Okay, we'll come into the West now, and the overwintering population. Just like the Mexican overwintering colonies, the overwintering populations in the West have also declined during the same time frame, 97 to 2015, estimated 80% plus decline. In the West, we've never had the population that the Eastern US has. It's always been a much smaller population. At its height, it might have been 1 to 2 million estimated over the Western US. And if you estimate the numbers from overwintering populations, and because our populations are smaller, we've actually had a program going since mid-1990s of counting the butterflies. And so our population estimates are actual counts of actual individual butterflies, or as well as can be done at the overwintering sites in the winter. So from that, we've seen a decline to about 0.25 of a million, or 250,000 in recent years. So we've had the same decline as the Eastern US, and this is the graph that shows that. So you can see back in '97 we had, you know, about 1.2 million butterflies at the overwintering sites, and these counts are taken from the famous Thanksgiving counts, which are done every Thanksgiving by a band of citizen scientists throughout up and down the coast of California, from, you know, San Diego in the south to Bolinas, north of San Francisco in the north. About 200 sites plus, been done for 20 years, as you can see, and they're the counts for every year. So you can see our decline happened sort of almost overnight. You know, the turn of the century, it went from 1.2 million to you know, 200,000 plus in '99. So there was a dramatic decline. And since that period of time, it's been pretty stable. There's been a couple of years where it's gone down to, you know, 99,000 or less than 100,000 a couple of years. But then it came back, and interestingly, it came back, you know, oops, we've gone forward. It came back sort of around the time that, you know, the butterfly was listed for potential listing as endangered, and a lot more interest in the monarch. And this line, the line going up through the graph here, is the number of volunteers doing the counts. So you can see, with once people realized that the monarch was in trouble, there was a huge increase in participation from citizens in helping with the monarch count. So in actual fact, you know, with these extra people helping, we should have enhanced the population even further, probably. But as you can see, it remained about 200,000 till 2017. And then something happened. The 2018-19 count went down from you know, 200,000 plus the previous year to 28,429. So that's the total number of monarchs at all the overwintering sites from south to north in that season. You know, 164,000 monarchs went missing, if you like, from the previous year. And so that was an 85% decline in 1 year. So that was very alarming, and is very alarming. And no site that year was found with more than 3,000 monarchs. And it was repeated last year, 2019-20. Again, there was less than 30,000 butterflies. The common feature for both of those years, as far as I can see, is the fact that there were severe late winter storms on the California coast, just at the time the monarchs were leaving the overwintering sites. They spent the whole winter there. They're at their, you know, their weakest probably at the end of overwintering, ready to fly away into Central California to lay their eggs and start the next generation. And the storms hit at that time, and these were really vicious storms, causing damage to some of the overwintering sites. And I feel that a lot of the population was trashed at that time. A lot of the females probably didn't make their way from the overwintering sites inland in those 2 seasons. So that's just a guess, but we certainly know that that's probably the most vulnerable time, you know, when they're leaving and looking for milkweed to lay their eggs to start the new season's population. And so there's that graph again, but showing in 2018 and 2019, the very low population. You can see the bars there barely showing at all. So, you know, it's going to be very interesting this year to see what we can see. Unfortunately, the signs are not very good. It's looking like the population may be even less than last year. You know, there's a couple of indicators that there's many people around the West making observations, and combining all the observations, it suggests that we may be looking at a total population of 10,000, perhaps, you know, from the whole of the Western US, 10,000 monarchs. So it really is becoming quite a dire situation. So given all that, and, you know, we're here in the Northwest, well, I am, and a lot of you are, encounters with monarchs in Washington are rare these days. I mean, these last 2 seasons, when we've had that big winter crash, we've barely seen monarchs in Washington. In 2019, we saw 8, and these are confirmed sightings. In 2020, this past summer, just 2 were sighted around the Tri-Cities in central Washington. And even those, I have my suspicions that perhaps these 2 were local releases by somebody that was rearing them. So not very good. You know, in contrast to 30, 40 years ago, monarchs were common garden butterflies during the summer in Washington. I've been told by the people that lived here at that time. It was easy to find caterpillars on backyard milkweed and along the irrigation canals. Those sort of things I haven't seen in the last 20 years. But you know, in 5 years ago even, we would see a fair few monarchs though. And it's just these last 2 years that it's been really bad. And we can't blame the lack of milkweed for their absence in Washington, because we have abundant milkweed in many locations. And, you know, the monarchs come up from California. We depend upon California populations to repopulate Washington and Oregon in the spring and summer. So, you know, it makes sense. When they get here, they've got plenty of milkweed to reproduce on. This is a highway near Yakima and to the Tri-Cities, I-82. And along that road, milkweed exists along its entire length, in some places in dense populations. And the Washington Road Department is actually actively preserving populations by not mowing it. And you know, they will mow part of the roadside, but leave the milkweed populations, which is great to see. And it's part of the pollinator initiative, you know, since 2014, and part of that initiative to help pollinator populations, and in this case, milkweed. But milkweed is also, and that's another talk, but milkweed is also good for other insects too, other pollinators and other beneficial insects. But as I said, that's another story. But it's not so in California, where milkweed populations along highways in particular, and this slide was taken in fairness about a decade or more ago, and when the highways department there was routinely spraying milkweed. I actually saw it being done, and you know, it was a routine thing. I don't know if that's changed now, but it's certainly something that needs to be reconsidered. I mean, obviously roadside management has to be done, but you know, incorporating milkweed survival somehow, as our Washington Road Department has done, needs to be contemplated. And I know this sort of thing, spraying a milkweed, also occurs in Oregon as well. So hopefully this is going to change in the future. And milkweed in agricultural land as well is something else, that's something that also needs to be reconsidered. I mean, there was far more milkweed in agricultural lands in the past than there is now. Farmers do a much better job at getting rid of milkweed than they used to in the past. So basically, the lack of milkweed as it concerns monarchs is most acute in California. And if we need to replace milkweed, it's California that we need to replace it. Aside from being damaged by late winter storms, the monarchs leaving the overwintering sites also have a challenge in finding milkweed populations when they go to the interior parts of California. It's not as common for them, you know, they're not able to find it as readily as perhaps they did back 20 or more years ago. So this map just shows what we generally know about monarch migration in the US. And I mentioned before about the populations in the eastern US all going to Mexico, as you can see there. And that was worked out many years ago by a tagging program that's been operating in the eastern US for many decades now. And that allowed us to work out they were going to Mexico, this major concentration there. The Western population, we've always known much less about it because there's less monarchs here, I suppose. There's also less research going on in the West. And particularly in the Northwest, we've known very little about monarchs in the Northwest. And when I arrived here 20 years ago, I was intrigued by that. We really didn't know much about monarchs in the Pacific Northwest, and particularly the migration of them as to where they spent the winter and where they migrated to. Particularly Washington, Oregon, Idaho, and British Columbia. And we assumed, and it's always been assumed, that they migrate to California, but the scientific evidence for that was quite lacking. There wasn't, much in the way of tagging programs to show that that's actually what they did. And then also around, well, when I first started getting interested in this in early this century, Bob Pyle wrote a book about monarchs and his travels with the monarch, migrating with monarchs, I think he called it, where one autumn he followed monarchs in their migration from British Columbia and Pacific Northwest through Washington, Idaho, Oregon, just observing the monarchs. At that time, they were observable. I mean, there weren't many. He didn't see a huge amount, but he did see enough to make some conclusions and observations about what they were doing. And if you haven't read that book, I suggest you seek it out and do that, because he found that a lot of them, when he saw them moving and migrating, flying, they were moving not southwest but more southerly or southeasterly. And he was curious about that and wondering if maybe some of them were actually heading towards Arizona, Utah, and then on to Mexico perhaps. So that was a possibility that he raised in that book, which piqued my interest even more. So before I get on to the tagging program that we've done since then, I'll talk a little bit about the monarch breeding sites in central Washington, eastern Washington. And this slide shows a typical one of the sites. And monarch breeding in the western US is, particularly in the Pacific Northwest anyway, is very different from the eastern US, where milkweed is more scattered across the landscape. You don't have to go very far before you find another patch of milkweed. In the arid Northwest, then you can often go a long way before you find milkweed, and then it tends to be aggregated in certain areas. And this slide shows an area called Lower Crab Creek in which such a thing occurs, where milkweed occurs in enormous densities, great densities. But you have to go a long way from Crab Creek to find any other significant concentration of milkweed. So you have these places where milkweed occurs very commonly, more patchy, larger gaps between patches, and often associated with riparian areas. Milkweed does pretty well under drought conditions, but it does still need a little bit of moisture to survive, particularly for the whole season. But this site and many other sites, the patches can be large, and in the past, and I'm just talking about 5-10 years ago, they can support monarch populations that are very large. Lower Crab Creek, when I was working there about 5 years ago, or even less, we routinely see populations that are estimated about 1,000 butterflies at the end of the season. And we did the estimates by mark recapture, where you get an estimate of population size. So, you could go to Lower Crab Creek, and I know a lot of WABA members have, and see monarch butterflies commonly. In fact, we used to have tagging days there. It seems very strange now in these last few years when we barely see a monarch, but we had enough monarchs for at least 1 year to actually go there and tag about 100 in a day, with a group of us helping out. And I hope we see that again, but we haven't seen that since that time, which was like 2016 or 2015 maybe. So it's a good site. It's a site that monarchs do very well, but as we all know, in eastern Washington and Idaho, it can get very hot in the summer, and monarchs don't like excessively hot conditions. Once temperatures go above 90, they begin to be less active. 95, 100 degrees, they need shade at that point. Shade trees are an important component of successful monarch breeding habitat in the West. You don't find good breeding habitat at the height of summer in milkweed patches that are exposed. They may be briefly used and then the butterflies move on. But for breeding colonies like at Crab Creek, then shade is very important to buffer them from the heat. And we found that actually at Crab Creek that a lot of the reproduction and breeding goes on underneath the trees in the shaded milkweed. This is a female here laying her eggs on milkweed under the trees. And this is showy milkweed, which you may or may not know is very broad-leaved, but under the limited light under trees, it sort of grows much thinner, but it's still suitable for monarch reproduction. And in fact, they preferentially choose these sites under trees to lay their eggs and for the caterpillars to develop, as you can see in the middle there, in a shaded situation. But the other problem they face at places like Crab Creek is the lack of nectar in high summer. Not many native flowers occur at that time in some of these sites, and particularly at Crab Creek, we don't really have any, particularly in very hot summers. And in those conditions, we've actually seen monarchs leave the sites in the high summer and go down to the river and seek out other places where nectar is existing. But interestingly, a noxious weed at Crab Creek has come to the rescue. This is purple loosestrife, which is, horrifies a lot of people because it can clog up waterways. It doesn't do that at Lower Crab Creek, I'm happy to say. It occurs in a few places where it's a little wetter than normal, and so it's able to thrive. But it provides a resource for monarchs to survive. And in some years, it's the only nectar that they have available in August and September, critical time when they're producing populations for migration. So it's an example of a noxious weed providing a key resource for our beloved monarch and other butterflies too, for their survival and persistence at the height of summer. And also another noxious weed at Crab Creek is also important. This is Russian olive, providing the shade that I was talking about before. There's a few other native trees, but most of the trees are Russian olive. So again, another example of a noxious weed providing an essential service for monarch butterflies. So the end of August, early September, monarchs leave these breeding areas in eastern Washington. So what's their destination? That's the million-dollar question that we had around 2010 and 2012. At that time, the evidence for it was limited to one tag recovery and field observations of Bob Pyle in the book that I mentioned, Chasing Monarchs. So not a great deal to go on. And so the solution I felt to that was going to be mass rearing, because on the landscape, as I mentioned, even in the good years, certainly in this century, we've never had enough monarchs flying around to be able to tag a significant number. You have to tag, as we've found in recent years, and also in the eastern US they've found, you have to tag about 200 to get one tag recovery. And so you've got to tag an awful lot of monarchs. And in the eastern US, in the autumn and the migration time, in many places you can catch a lot of monarchs. You can catch hundreds and tag them. And if you've got lots of people doing that, you can do it quite successfully. But in the Pacific Northwest, we have far fewer people scattered around, and we have far fewer monarchs. So that's not going to work here. Might have done in the 80s perhaps, but it's certainly not since I've been in the Pacific Northwest. So mass rearing was what I thought we needed to do. So that's when we decided to do the Pacific Northwest Monarch Tagging Program. But this was a program that wasn't funded by anybody. I didn't approach anybody for funds. It was actually sort of a hobby to begin with, and sort of the work that I did when I wasn't doing the work I'm supposed to do as an agricultural entomologist. And so I really couldn't spend a lot of my time mass rearing monarchs in the laboratory. And so one day I had a phone call from the Washington State Penitentiary at Walla Walla. They'd heard about my interest and research on butterflies and wanted to know if there was something I could get give the inmates at the penitentiary to do that would concern butterflies and bringing them closer to the outdoors without letting them go in the outdoors. And so I immediately thought of this project. Could we get the prisoners to mass rear monarch butterflies for tagging and start this tagging program? and they love the idea. And long story short, we've been doing this for a long time now. But before I leave this slide, I also have to mention that, the prisoners were the first to do the tagging, but then now we also have citizen scientists generally, just people that have heard about the program that are interested, Pacific Northwest land and butterfly conservation groups, including Washington Butterfly Association and many other groups. So it's, it's not just the inmates anymore, it's far more than that. But it was an unlikely pairing, as is evident, butterflies and convicts. And whenever I look at this slide, it looks like I staged it or something, like, got somebody to dress up as a prisoner or something. But this is a real prisoner in Walla Walla Penitentiary in their monarch rearing room. And they just love the program. I can't say enough about how much they love it. They have options of, this is part of the mental health program within the prison, and they have other things that they do as well, like looking after puppies and kittens. And but the Monarch program is at the top of their list of the things they want to do. And I have to say that this past year, with our lack of monarchs, we were not able to provide them with any monarchs. So for the first time since 2012, we didn't do this program. And I'm sure the prisoners were quite upset about that. So I call this incarcerated citizen science for obvious reasons. And it's been, a big reason why we've been able to gather the data that we have, simply by these people in the prison rearing monarch butterflies. And we've been doing this, as I say, since 2012 to 2019, and I hope we can do it again in the future. At the beginning, I told them what was required, the equipment they needed. So they went about and made the equipment themselves from recycled materials. I emphasized that cleanliness was the key. We were only going to do this once a year, by the way. It's not a continual rearing program or anything. It was done once a year to minimize any disease problems or anything that might occur. I told them that cleanliness was what needed to be done to avoid disease problems. And they did a great job at that. Their devotion to caterpillar rearing is remarkable. It's a cliche and I always say it, but they do have time on their hands, and they were able to give them the time that many people can't. Even citizen scientists, rearers, have got other things to do in their lives, and scientists like me do too. So there's only a certain amount of time you can spend with the caterpillars, but these guys literally spent every moment they could with the caterpillars, watching them grow and making sure they didn't escape and tread on them. Occasionally one would get away and they'd put their boot on it and they'd be mortified that they had actually killed one of their caterpillars. But they had a very high survival rate, remarkable survival rate, approaching 80–90% in most years, which I put down to the exceptional cleanliness and hygienic conditions that they were reared in. And then, I had to show them how to tag monarch butterflies. And this is me doing that and trying to convince them that yes, you can hold a monarch butterfly. It's not going to fall apart in your hands. You're not going to hurt it. And these were guys, these are long-term prisoners. They're in there for life. They're life prisoners. They're not short-term people. So they're in there for doing things much worse than killing a butterfly. So it was a bit hard to get my head wrapped around that concept and idea when I was talking to them, thinking, well, I wasn't thinking that they were murderers. I was just showing them what needed to be done. And they were, very concerned that they would hurt the butterfly. And I guess it wasn't until I left that I realized that that was a very strange experience indeed. But they learned and they did a good job. And so I'll move on to the data now. During that period of time, and just recently, I published a paper on this already that I'll show the reference to in a minute. And if you're interested, you can contact me for it. But I've just submitted the second paper in the series, looking at data from the second part of the program. So I do have these numbers now, which is fortunate. So that, during 2012 to 2019, we reared 27,820 monarchs tagged reared, tagged and released in the Pacific Northwest, which is a remarkable number when you think of it. It's the number that we saw overwintering almost to the exact individual actually last winter. So, you know, we did a very good job at producing monarchs for the population. Not that it's a conservation measure by any means, and that's not the purpose of this. Obviously, we were doing this for tagging and to get data on their destination. So from 27,820, we had 182 recoveries, which is 0.62%, which is pretty much as expected. So as you can see, you know, 182 data points is good. We got good data from that, but you know, we had to rear a lot of monarchs to get that data. And these were monarchs that flew more than 10 miles. You know, the ones that flew less than 10 miles, we didn't include because they probably weren't migrating. We also tagged, you know, 1,300 plus wild monarchs during the time, particularly citizen scientists in Idaho and Oregon. And so that they were added to the total as well. So you can add that to the previous slide's number. But interestingly, we only had one recovery from the wild monarchs that we tagged, which is very interesting, given that there's a lot of concern in the eastern US about mass rearing monarchs. And a lot of what we did wasn't mass rearing, it was, you know, small numbers, but, you know, artificially rearing monarchs and thinking that they are not, or showing in some cases that they are not as successful in migrating as wild monarchs. And so, and you know, they'd have less recoveries of reared monarchs than wild monarchs. But in the West, it's been the opposite. We've only had one recovery from those 1,000 plus wild monarchs, and those 182 were from the reared monarchs. So there's the reference there. And if you're interested in the first paper, I'm happy to send it to you. So I'll show a series of maps now that show some of the destinations and release points and destinations. So you can see, you know, these were individuals tagged in Washington during the first part of the project. And you can see that the majority, all apart from one, so it's just one individual that decided wanted to spend winter somewhere around Brigham City. He actually died at Brigham City, so he was on his way somewhere. And I'm thinking he's going to go through Utah and into Arizona and probably onto Mexico, but you know, we'll never know. But that individual made that journey in contrast to the others that flew to the California coast at overwintering sites from Bolinas in the north to Goleta in the south. You know, which is pretty much the spread of overwintering sites along the California coast. So clearly our Washington butterflies do a lot to populate the population term the overwintering sites all along the California coast. And this is the second part of the project. Last couple of years, in the last couple of years, we tagged a lot more than the first period of time. And we had a lot more recoveries too. Actually, more recoveries than the number tagged. So, but we had the same thing. Again, we had this time two individuals that were flying in completely different directions. One from Yakima to Glens Ferry, which clearly wasn't going to California, and also one at Pendleton, which is only 100 odd miles from Yakima, but still probably not going to California as well. So, you know, I still believe that some of our butterflies do not go to California and go somewhere else. And when I get to Idaho, you'll see there's even more reason to suggest that. But you can see the majority went to the California coast again. So in Idaho, we've had far fewer tagged because we've got less people involved over there, and particularly rearing people, far fewer. But the few tag recoveries we've had, most of them have been to the south and southeast. We have had a couple like this one here that flew from you know, around Coeur d'Alene, Rathdrum, that area, flew to Walla Walla, but a lot of them, or a few of them, went in a different direction further south. And in the second part of the project, we had a similar number doing the same thing. And so we do need more tagging in Idaho, but it seems like there's a bigger percentage in Idaho that do not fly southwest, but they're flying more south to southeast. And in fact, in entire project, we've only had one Idaho butterfly turn up on the California coast, which I'll show the slide in a minute. So moving on to Oregon, all the butterflies tagged in Oregon, whether it's mid-Oregon, northern Oregon, or particularly southern Oregon, they all fly to the California coast, as you can see there. Whether they're tagged on the coast in Oregon, anywhere in Oregon, they fly to the coast, which makes sense because they're so close to the California coast. And you know, Oregon butterflies probably comprise a large proportion of overwintering populations. And again, in the latest series of data, it had the same outcome. And so this shows all the data together, I think, but it's important because we see the single one from Boise to around Santa Barbara near an overwintering site as the only individual that that flew from Idaho to California. So I really believe the further east you go in the Pacific Northwest, the more likely monarchs are to not go to California, but to go somewhere else. And we're thinking maybe it could be Mexico. There's a lot of problems, of course, and we're going to have to do a lot of tagging up here to get data because this is such a vast area of unpopulated human population area, and nobody there to find the butterflies, and a greater distance. So more problems can happen to the butterflies, mortality is going to be higher. And then if they get to Mexico, they're going to be absorbed into the huge populations that occur there, and finding our Pacific Northwest tag could be very difficult to do. I mean, every year tags are found in Mexico from the eastern US. And in fact, you know, we've been doing this project for 8 years now, and we haven't had a tag back from Mexico. But it doesn't mean to say we won't, because sometimes the people in Mexico that find tags, and often local people there, will hang on to the tags for years, because American researchers will pay $5 or something per tag, and so they hold on to the tags for another year and then cash them in. So it's, some tags have turned up, eastern US tags have turned up 20 years after they were tagged. So it's still possible we could get tagged from Mexico. So the conclusions from the work we've done so far is that most of the Washington tag monarchs, more than 90% migrate to California, but about 6% have flown more than 100 miles to the southeast. So there's a small proportion of Washington butterflies, and most of our Washington tag monarchs have been from Yakima and Walla Walla, not further east, not like Spokane. We just started tagging in recent years in Spokane. And if we ever get back to good populations, hopefully we'll do more. And I would think that Spokane monarchs might be more likely to fly southeast than Walla Walla or Yakima tag monarchs. And about 60% of Idaho tag monarchs flew south or southeast. And a lot of these Idaho tag monarchs have been very close to the Washington border. So that, strengthens my, ideas about Spokane. All the recovered Oregon monarchs are in California. The longest distance so far is 865 miles from Washington and 700 miles from Oregon. And these are impressive distances, obviously, for a butterfly to fly, but they're still, only a third, maybe a quarter of what some eastern US monarchs can fly from southern Canada to Mexico. So they have a bigger challenge in flying that distance, and our monarchs have got it relatively easy. And then the other interesting thing that's come from this work is we've gained some evidence that some Pacific Northwest monarchs go to the California, contribute to the California winter breeding population. So this slide, you can't see it very well, but this is an actual slide that citizen scientists took in their backyard on their homegrown milkweed of a monarch, female monarch, tag one. You can see the tag number laying its eggs on the milkweed, and this was a monarch that had been tagged 3 weeks previous in Oregon, that had flown 300, 400 miles, obviously a migrant, probably, invariably non-reproductive to begin with. I mean, monarchs don't fly that distance unless they're non-reproductive. shut down their reproductive system and go to join the overwintering sites where they remain in reproductive dormancy. But this individual obviously was different. The female that encountered milkweed had matured its reproductive system, had eggs, and was laying eggs. And so we had two instances of this, one in a San Francisco suburb and one near Los Angeles. Both had migrated, up to 550 miles, but they both abandoned reproductive dormancy in favor of reproduction. Maybe because of the climate that was encountered. Climate warming is occurring in California, obviously, and but maybe this has always happened to a small proportion of individuals coming down from Pacific Northwest, taking a chance in reproducing instead of overwintering as dormant individuals. And maybe the number of individuals that do this now is increasing with increasing temperatures. Prior to 2000, the year 2000, all year or year-round breeding populations in California only occurred around San Diego and far south Southern California. They've now shifted forward. You can have shifted north, sorry. So you can have year-round breeding populations closer to Los Angeles, and even some evidence around San Francisco in some years too. So it's possible. So this is important because it's a possibility that some of our population that we think we are losing because the numbers of overwintering sites are crashing or declining. It may be that some of them are simply joining reproductive populations in California, and therefore, we're not counting them. We can't, count them. So only 2 of our tag monarchs did this, but that's because they turned up in people's backyards, and monarch people's backyards that were, on the lookout. And, a lot of our tag monarchs that become reproductive may be becoming reproductive in areas that nobody's seeing them, in wild milkweed, and in gardens that nobody's actually taking notice. So it could be a bigger proportion of the population than 2 out of 182 suggests. But it's an interesting point, and it's something we need to keep an eye on in the future, because it's not a bad thing. Joining the reproductive population is okay, it's fine. But then the question is, do they return again? And they probably do, but somebody needs to do the research to show that. It wouldn't be them, but their progeny at some point may return and migrate northward in the spring, even though they've been reproducing in the winter and not being dormant in an overwintering site. But someone needs to do the research to document that. So yeah, that just reiterates what I've said, so I won't show that. And the other thing that we've got from our program is proof of length of life. We've talked about monarchs over, the overwintering generation, the super generation is living much longer than the reproductive generation. Reproductive individuals live 4 to 6 weeks, and we thought overwintering individuals live for 9 to 10 months. But there's never, that hasn't been documented very well. It seems to be anecdotal more than anything. But the tagging program has provided at least, evidence, well, we've got quite a lot of evidence, but I'm showing this one here as being the longest lived so far, which is this individual here that was, this photograph was taken by a member of the public who's having lunch at a restaurant in Cayucas in California on June the 26th, 2019. Just leaned over with his cell phone, I suppose, and took the picture. It turns out it was tagged the previous August in Ashland, Oregon. So 312 days or 10 months. So we know this monarch, looking very worse for wear, with only half a hindwing, had lived for 10 months. So proof of quite a long length of life for this overwintering monarch. The question I've got a lot recently, people have asked me recently about wildfire smoke and hazardous air affecting monarch migration. It seems that we're getting more frequent wildfires, not only in the Pacific Northwest, but also in California, and usually around the time that the migration is going on, as it did this year. I took this picture in my backyard on September the 13th, and this is the sun, not the moon. So the air was really bad. but how does it affect monarch migration? Well, you know, we've guessed in the past, and there's no research on this at all. I mean, obviously, if there's a wildfire burning up monarch habitat, then that's a problem if they're breeding there, you know, and that happens occasionally, I'm sure. But you know, most of the fires that are taking place in late summer and autumn have been, you know, recent times in forested areas and probably not burning monarch habitat. So probably the bigger question is the smoky air. Can the monarchs navigate through this pea soup of an atmosphere? So the tagging program again helped in this because of I don't know, the great citizen scientists I have in doing this tagging program. A number of them took it upon themselves when they were faced with this hazardous air, when they released butterflies, was to record the air quality at the same time. So they knew the air quality, and enough people did that on enough occasions that I actually have now some data. And this is just one set. I have two sets. So a replica of this, and hopefully we'll get more this year. By their own, they're not very, you know, there's not a lot of data here, but they do suggest that monarchs are able to navigate very well through smoky atmosphere. So, so here in this particular instance, monarchs were released into smoky air. There were 4 of them released into these. So these are tagged monarchs in Brookings, Oregon, and 9 of 307 released in smoky or non-smoky air in 2017 in approximately the same time period, you know, August, September, were recovered in California. So we had 9 individuals to deal from, and 4 were released in smoky air and 5 in non-smoky air. And there was no difference between those 2 small groups in the distance they flew. You know, they both flew about 570 kilometers or lived, you know, their length of life from you know, following them in the overwintering colonies. And we can see how long they lived for from when they were tagged. And there was no difference there, really, not statistical. In fact, the smoky air ones live apparently longer. But, you know, it's limited data, but it does suggest in this small sample that the smoke did not present these individuals with an insurmountable problem. They were released into really bad air, AQI of greater than 225. So that's at the hazardous level. So, you know, you can't really say for sure, but it does suggest that they are able to navigate through. And their navigation to overwintering and along migration routes is determined by the sun. So I suppose if they can see the sun, as in this slide here, even if it's you know, a much dimmer thing than it should be, it's still enough information for them to get to where they need to get to. Okay, so there's been, with the tagging program, there's been many great human interest stories as well that, you know, I really believe in, because they do advance monarch science as well, because as well as being a good story, they invariably provide data, but they also, you know, help in outreach and advocacy for the general public, or to the general public, and children too, because a lot of the stories involve children. So this one here, as an example, I'll tell you about, called Amelia's Monarch, and Amelia is the girl on the right here in the striped shirt. And so this is a small group of children that reared monarchs in 2016. I think they only reared 15 or 20. So you probably would expect not to see the monarchs again. And I'm sure the teacher told them they probably weren't going to see them again. But Amelia's Monarch we did see again. Released from Corvallis, Oregon, Amelia's Monarch was found, you know, 19 days later. You can tell from the slide where this is, San Francisco, in a rooftop apartment where there were flowers growing, and Amelia's Monarch stopped off for nectar in Lisa DeAngelis's place, and she had a cell phone and got the tag number and emailed me, and therefore I was able to tell Amelia that her monarch had been seen, had flown 470 miles in 19 days, and was now happily in San Francisco, enjoying the sunshine there. And normally, when you tag and you get a tag recovery like this, that's the end of the story. You know, that you don't see the butterfly again. But Amelia's Monarch was a special monarch, because we saw Amelia's Monarch again. This time by John Dayton, who's a good friend of mine who lives in Santa Cruz, and therefore is looking at the colonies there all through the winter, and he found Amelia's monarch on October the 11th, a few days after it was seen in San Francisco. So, you know, it had its nectar stop there and then flew on to an overwintering site, this Lighthouse Field in Santa Cruz. And so that was amazing. So I was able to tell Amelia that her monarch was now at its overwintering site, and probably was going to stay there in Santa Cruz for the winter. But we hadn't reckoned on Amelia's monarch moving around a bit more, because it flew to another overwintering site at Santa Cruz, the Natural Bridges overwintering site, which is just down the road, a couple of miles down the road. But Amelia's monarch had decided that Lighthouse Field wasn't good enough, perhaps, and going to move on to Natural Bridges, where one of our citizen scientists spotted her there and got the number and informed me. And so again, that was remarkable. So this is where we're now collecting data about moving, monarchs moving between sites, which there was very little data on that prior. But Amelia's monarch was not finished. There are 3 overwintering sites, major overwintering sites in Santa Cruz. And sure enough, she decided, or this monarch decided, to move to the 3rd one by December the 30th, when John Dayton saw it there at that time. So, you know, 1 monarch, 4 resightings at 4 locations. So a great little story for Amelia, and I'm sure she's never going to forget that monarch she reared and how it, you know, traveled to San Francisco and then all around Santa Cruz for that winter. And I got the data from it as well. And then the second story briefly mentioned is a monarch called Journey, well named, reared by Sisters Middle School students, 4th graders, in the same year, 2016. And this was a monarch that had the longest journey so far by an Oregon monarch. It was found in Carpinteria, 700 miles away. And so that was a great piece of data on its own, great story on its own. But these children were so enamored by the fact that their journey went on its journey and got to, you know, California, that they decided to write a book on it, or to write chapters, or to write their accounts of how they imagined Journey would make the journey. So they envisaged Journey's encounters with birds, a magpie, with cars, with, you know, all the hazards that Journey had to get past before she arrived, or he, I think, was arrived at the overwintering site. And with the help of the teacher and the local author, it became a book, Journey's Flight, One Western Monarch's Record-Setting Migration, by Sisters Middle School students. It's actually available on Amazon. So if you Google Journey's Flight there, you will, or just search for Journey's Flight, you'll find that book. And so that one-tag monarch is going to be advocating for monarchs for years to come, because it became the basis of this book, and these enraptured students that envisaged their journey of their butterfly. So the overwintering sites, there, as I mentioned, there are more than 200 known overwintering sites, and in very strange places, like this small park in Ventura. There's just a small colony there. Some of them are very, you know, have very small populations, particularly now, of course, when we have such a small population. This is one of the more interesting sites. This is New Park Shopping Mall, which always has just a few. And this was of interest to me because on December the 31st, New Year's Eve in 2015, my family and I were down looking for tag monarchs in California, and we stopped here at the shopping mall. The family went to do some shopping, and I went to the overwintering site over there, and there was only 100 monarchs there, but a tag monarch from the penitentiary, one of the prisoner monarchs, was there. So I was able to tell them that their monarch was hanging out at the shopping mall in California. And another one from the penitentiary was found in a very small colony near Santa Barbara. So, you know, you can find a tag butterfly in just a small colony. So everyone needs to be checked. And many people have found them for us, of course. And, you know, I have to thank everybody that's found our monarchs. And I try to list them all in the papers I produce. But the overwintering sites, there's many of them, but some of them are, well, they're all vulnerable to weather, of course, and some of them are vulnerable to urban development. This is Lighthouse Field after one of the winter storms I was talking about that I think caused the population decline. And there, you know, we don't know all the conditions that are necessary for successful overwintering in terms of the trees they need and the arrangement of the trees. So we, you know, really don't want to see things like this happen, because it could alter the characteristics for the monarchs, and they may have to go and find another site. So there's renewed focus now with, you know, conservation concerns on preserving and managing overwintering sites. However, as I said, we still do not know exactly what is best for monarch survival, and also importantly in my mind, what is best for maximizing their post-clustering reproductive potential. And I think, you know, I've mentioned before earlier, and other people are beginning to realize the same thing, saying the same thing, that the most vulnerable period is when they leave these overwintering sites after Valentine's Day. It usually is late February, early March. That's their critical period. They've got to, the females have got to make it to milkweed and lay their eggs and get the next generation on the way. And so that's the critical time. We know very little about that activity at that time, their flight behavior and where they actually go. And then I hearken back to Australia, where, as I said, I did my PhD work, and monarchs overwinter in Australia exactly the same way as they do in California. There are a lot of similarities. There are some differences, but there's a lot of similarities too. So this is an overwintering site, and a lot of overwintering sites there are little gullies like this. Not all of them, but a lot of them are. But the thing that is a fixed thing about overwintering in Australia of monarch butterflies is the fact that milkweed is at all of the sites. You don't find overwintering sites without milkweed. That's a prerequisite. And so, you know, my research there showed that at the time. And of course, that's not the case in California. It's not found at California overwintering sites at all. And, you know, and that's probably because they're on the coast, the overwintering sites, and because of the coastal climate, the milkweed we have doesn't do that well close to the coast. So you need to go inland a mile or so, and then milkweed will survive, but generally not right close to the coast, as some of the overwintering sites are. But you know, maybe milkweed should be a bit closer to the overwintering sites than what it is. But a lot of people are loath to suggest that because of the thinking that having milkweed close to overwintering monarchs is going to disrupt their overwintering behavior. But, you know, from my Australian research, that's clearly not the case. We have... yeah, it's clearly not the case. It doesn't happen with Australian monarchs. So again, I've got ahead of myself with the slides. So, you know, we can actually have Australian overwintering monarchs clustering milkweed. So this is remarkable. And this is a slide that's taken by, not me, it's taken by somebody, you know, that saw monarchs overwintering in their property a couple of years ago. These are monarchs that are in reproductive dormancy, and they stayed in reproductive dormancy. They're not reproductive at all, and yet they're in close association with milkweed, and it's not changing their behavior. Their migration and reproductive behavior is determined by day length and celestial cues, not host plant availability. So, you know, the idea that we shouldn't have milkweed overwintering sites is not based on you know, the science as we know it anyway. I mean, it is possible that Australian monarchs are different from American monarchs, but you know, we should at the very least look at that. The circle, I think, actually outlines a caterpillar that's actually on the milkweed, and that's the other interesting thing about overwintering sites in Australia. Some of them have reproductive and non-reproductive populations existing at the same location, but they stay, the non-reproductive populations stay non-reproductive despite the presence of reproductive butterflies around them. They're two distinct populations that have been determined by the cues that they had from day length and the weather when they emerge from their pupae, and they stay fixed in those conditions until they change again, and the milkweed doesn't cause that change. So as I said, back in the day, in the 1980s, working on the Monarch. So yeah, I'm not sure I put those slides in, but I guess the interesting thing is that, when I started working on the Monarch over there, I was told, they were much more common than they used to be, and the literature showed that. When I started looking at them in 1978, populations in Sydney, Australia, there was a 90% decline from what was known previously in the early mid 1960s, and so a very similar situation to what we've done, what's happened here in the last 20 years, where we've seen a 90% decline. But the interesting thing is, they haven't increased in that last 40 years, but they haven't disappeared. They haven't become extinct. There's a lot of people that are concerned that what we're seeing now in the West is the beginning of extinction, that we're going to see the monarch butterfly disappear. But I look at what happened in Sydney, New South Wales, and it doesn't translate to that. It means that they can hang on at much lower level. A drastic decline doesn't invariably mean extinction. They can still survive at a lower level, as they do in New South Wales. And we did some work recently looking at populations there, and they're hanging on. Overwintering colonies may look like this in the near future. And when I made this slide, this was a couple of years ago, actually, I didn't think that this might represent this year, 2020. This is what overwintering populations at some sites that normally have many hundreds might look like this year. In Australia, you can get excited at seeing 8 monarchs clustering on a tree in the beginning of winter, because it's an overwintering population. This is what we may see in the near future in California. But I do have optimism and hope for the future. Half of that is what I've just said. They're not going to go extinct. They'll hang on, and we can do things to help them come back. And we are doing things already. Helping milkweed populations, working out the vulnerable period of their life cycle when they leave the overwintering populations, and trying to make sure they have milkweed available. Having milkweed closer to the overwintering sites, I think, is not a bad thing to do, if it enables some reproduction to occur before they leave. And we don't know, even simple thing like, we don't know, do they immediately leave the colony and fly 100 miles before stopping, or do they fly a mile and then another mile, and then looking for milkweed en route as they go? We've no idea. So we need to know these things a bit more. When we do, we'll be better armed to help the population. But there are other possibilities for a significant rebound in population size any year in the future, maybe this year. And this stems from the fact that some time ago we realized that some of the population in Mexico in the spring, there is some movement towards the west. Not, the bulk of the butterflies in Mexico fly to the east and repopulate the east, but there is some that fly to the west, and in some years in particular there's more. And we know from Arizona tagging that quite a few go to Mexico for overwintering, and some from Arizona also go to California. So they have flying to California and flying to Mexico, as we may have. As I've said earlier, we may have a similar situation. But the interesting thing is that we do have this leakage, if you like, of the population to the west in some years, or in most years, but in some years it could be more significant. I mean, in the last 2 years, we have seen evidence of a small number of individuals leaving Mexico and turning up in Arizona at the right time, and then heading up. And these individuals seem to head up through Utah, through Arizona and Utah, and into Idaho. So in the past 2 seasons, when we've had very bad populations in Northern Oregon and Washington, we've actually seen better populations in Idaho and Utah, probably because of this influence from from the Mexican population going up this route here. Now, this was first thought about or mentioned by Lincoln Brower and Bob Pyle in a paper together, first suggested by them, and he postulated that these incursions were essential to the sustainability of the Western population, since our landscape is so arid and dry, and we might be subject to declines in population, and this could be an important part of the sustainability. And I tend to think that's probably true. And he did show in a couple of years when the winds were driving the migrants leaving Mexico to a more westerly position, that the population in the West was larger. He drew some correlations there. So this I like to think of as the Browers burst, perhaps, and I'm looking forward to it happening in the future. I've looked to it for the last couple of years without luck, but I'm fairly optimistic that it's going to happen in a sizable way at some time in the future. As I said, even the last 2 years, there's been some evidence that it's occurring, but I think at some point it's going to be quite dramatic. And in that case, that could be a great boon to our population. So getting near the end of my talk now, what can you do for monarchs? Be an advocate, of course, I think that's most important. Growing milkweed, is always good. I mentioned briefly that milkweed is not just for monarchs, it's for other pollinators too, and also for biological control of pest insects. It's actually good for enhancing populations of biocontrol agents, would you believe? And so, it has many benefits. And so I'm advocating all I can, and particularly in agriculture, since I work in agriculture and particularly in vineyards at the moment, advocating for the use of milkweed in agriculture. And I wrote a paper on the beneficial insect attraction to milkweeds that's referenced there. And again, if you're interested, I can send you a copy of that. And this is actually a commercial vineyard, and this is milkweed growing along the edge there. So these particular people that grow this vineyard are actually interested in monarchs too. But, I'm also selling the idea to viticulturists in Eastern Washington that they can grow milkweed for improving biological control of pests in their vineyard, as well as helping monarch butterfly populations. And it's an attractive proposition. People are doing that, and so this is another way we can help monarchs by helping by putting more milkweed in or close to agriculture. And it doesn't have to be totally within agriculture, just outside of agriculture, perhaps. And also, there's been concern about the toxicity of milkweeds to livestock, but this is, a shot taken in Washington where the cows are grazing quite happily around milkweed. They don't like the taste of milkweed. They won't eat it. And a lot of milkweed's not that toxic anyway, particularly our showy milkweed. And I'm sure they take a bite of it and don't like the taste and then leave it. So it's not, this farmer's actually realized he doesn't need to get rid of all the milkweed and lets it be. And unfortunately, I don't think that message is quite the same in California. And this would be a rare picture in California, perhaps. But, it's certainly not something that you need to get rid of every stalk from every grazing field to protect your livestock. And don't use pesticides. I mean, I spoke about the neonicotinoids earlier in home gardens in particular. I'm part of my agriculture work, or most of it is biological control, using beneficial insects to help control pests. So, using less pesticide is part of that in agriculture. But, I'd say with home gardens to avoid the pesticides as much as you can. But if you have to use pesticides, avoid the neonicotinoids, so you're not contaminating your nectar with these materials and possibly hurting pollinators. And involving and advocating, young people, getting young people involved. And this shot is of a young girl in Oregon that just is in love with monarchs and is telling her friends about it. And we need these sort of advocates amongst young people to make sure the message continues to the future generations. And finally, I'm getting near the end. I have this Facebook page, some of you will be familiar with, where we report all the tag recoveries and any other information on monarch butterflies in the Pacific Northwest. And I just want to thank a few people, like Bob Pyle, Chip Taylor, John Dayton in particular, who's found the majority of my tag recoveries in Santa Cruz, because he lives there and loves monarchs and visits the colonies all the time. Linda Kaplan in Southern Oregon, and a whole host of people, whole host of taggers, all the citizen scientists involved. And the WABA, of course, have been very important in this work, as well as the Cowish Canyon Conservancy and other monarch advocates everywhere else, in Brookings, Bend, Southern Oregon. I mean, there's groups of monarch people popping up all over the Western US that are advocating monarch butterflies and their conservation, and just more recently the Western Monarch Advocate Group as well. So that's why I have optimism, because there's so many people invested and involved in this program now, and this research and other people's research, and so I think the future, is bright, really. Thank you very much for listening. If you are still there, it's very funny, odd talking to a screen and not hearing anybody. You might have all gone home for all I know, but thank you.
Thank you, David.
Thank you so much, David.
I'll stop my sharing. There you go.
Was there anybody that had questions? We did have a few on the question box.
That's on.
Oh, I had a question about where the most eastern rabbit monarchs were that were collected for rearing at the state penitentiary.
Where they were collected from? Well,
yes.
So in the years that we were doing that, I would collect them from somewhere in Washington, usually Crab Creek, because the populations were the highest there. And so all I'd do was collect half a dozen females perhaps, and get them to lay eggs. And each female can lay potentially up to 500 eggs, 600 eggs, and then provide those eggs or first infant larvae to the inmates. And so that's why we didn't do it this year, because we didn't have any wild monarchs in Washington.
So do you think that if you were able to collect monarchs from, say, Utah, or that you would find more distinct migrations to the south in those populations if you were able to collect gravid females and raise caterpillars from there?
Yeah, I think so. I don't think it's the origin of where they come from. It's the conditions that they experience, the day length and the sun cues, that causes where they go to. So monarchs that grow up in Idaho will respond to Idaho conditions. So if I brought them to Washington, they'd respond to Washington conditions and react as if they were Washington monarchs. So yeah, so I wouldn't really want to get Idaho monarchs for release in Washington, but we certainly need people in Idaho to rear monarchs and tag them there. I mentioned earlier, we've had relatively few there.
Thank you. It was a great talk, by the way. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So I had a question. Which direction do Australian monarchs migrate? Do they migrate towards the north?
Just from what we see.
They migrate. Well, they migrate. I've got to think now, because our ones from Washington go southwest. So in New South Wales, Australia, they go northeast. So it's the exact opposite. Yeah. So I actually did some experiments where I released them. So the monarchs in Sydney, they overwinter in Sydney, but they come from New South Wales, the country areas of New South Wales. There's places like Canberra, if you know Australia at all, which is southwest of Sydney. And so if you release monarchs in Canberra, they fly to Sydney, so they're flying northeast. And so yeah, if you release them in Sydney, they fly northeast up the coast further. So it's the exact opposite of here.
Thank you, David.
Interesting question.
Okay, and then I had another question. Has anyone tried to salvage dead monarchs in the wintering areas and use stable isotope analysis to figure out where they came from?
Yeah, there has been some work done on that by a guy in California whose name escapes me. So he published one paper on that and showed that pretty much what the tagging has showed, that individuals in the colonies come from the places that we said, you know, Idaho, Washington, Oregon. He also showed that a lot of them were from California too. So yeah, that work needs to be done again because there was some issues with it, but yeah, that's another way of doing it, and there is work in that area.
Okay, and has any work been done with vineyard owners in California regarding the benefits of milkweed?
Not to my knowledge, no, I don't think so, because yeah, that would be something that would be good to be done.
Okay, and then the milkweed are growing well in Montana. Can we buy monarchs to get them started?
No, we don't advocate that at all. You know, that's one thing that is a no-no, is to move monarchs around from different places. I mean, the only place that where there's people that breed monarchs in the West is California, and we don't want California monarchs being transferred to Montana, for example, because the people that rear these monarchs rear them year round, and there are issues with disease. Recent research has shown that factory reared monarchs do not migrate as well. They have issues in migration. They're less healthy basically, and so Montana, I didn't mention that we do actually have a couple of taggers in Montana now, and you know, the populations up there in some years are not too bad, and so it shouldn't be too difficult to get monarchs there and to use local breeding stock there, because Montana's interesting because it's on the edge of both eastern and western population. Maybe the east part of the state is one and the west part's the other, and so we do need more tagging there as well to see where they go. But yeah, importing of monarchs from factories, butterfly factories, is not recommended. Okay.
And then I also have a comment that says, I'm on Adriana. I am in Santa Cruz, California, and although Santa Cruz is famous overwintering area, I can tell you from direct experience that we have monarchs here thriving and laying eggs for the most part from April until at least the end of October. I'm active in tagging program through Cal Poly's, but for the most part, the party line around here still seems to be monarchs come at the end of October, migrating from colder climates and leaving to lay later winter, early spring for warm climates. I find this odd and frustrating, and wondering if you have any data to share regarding migration or lack of migration patterns for the Western monarchs.
No, as I said, that's the problem. We don't have any data down there as to what they do. From some of the information I've received from Santa Cruz people, it does seem that the situation's changing down there somewhat. They don't normally breed year round down there, but they seem to be doing that more now. But there's also a lot of people down there that have become monarch advocates and are rearing them in their backyards. And so there's a lot of interest in that community, and that may be influencing things too. But yeah, there's nobody doing any active research on the return migration, unfortunately. So as I said towards the end of my lecture, that's something that really needs to be done.
Well, this particular program that I'm tagging from is from Cal Poly San Luis Obispo. I don't know how, I never hear back. I think I'll do 50 this year, but I've never heard whether they've anything about it. So I mean, I'm assuming, my hope was that they would find out whether these butterflies are heading north or whether they're just staying here to overwinter. But I don't know. And I don't know how many people are active in the program either.
Okay, yeah, well, so. Really, you know, in my program, I tell the taggers when their butterflies are found. I would have thought they would have told you if any of your butterflies have been found. And also they haven't published their work recently or any time really
Yeah.
about tagging. So we really don't know. I mean, that they presumably know, but yeah, I don't know. And also, you know, so our butterflies go to the colonies in Santa Cruz, are tagged, and then they leave again. But we've never had one of those individuals found again in the spring. I mean, it's possible that, you know, that should happen, but that's never happened yet, which will give us some idea as to where they're going. But that's
Maybe I'll find one.
yeah.
Okay, and I had one more question from Amy. Before purple loosestrife was widespread, how did monarchs cope? Were there different nectaring plants, different weather patterns, or did monarchs move locally, as you said, to areas with more nectaring plants? Yeah, I think it was probably the latter. And also that only happens in very hot years. We had, you know, a year 2015, I think it was, when we had 2 weeks of 110 degrees, you know, every day, just about. And so those extreme conditions maybe didn't happen in the past as much. That could be another factor as well. And there are, you know, that particular site, that, I mean, there are native plants that will flower during the height of summer under those conditions. We just need to get them put in at that place because they're not there at the moment. But yeah, I think in the past they probably abandoned the site when conditions like that occurred. Okay, great. Thank you so much, David James. We learned a lot. Thank you for listening and still being here. Very awesome. And we appreciate everybody showing up and taking part. And yes, thank you so much. Thank you. Good night, everyone. Good night.